The restaurant had 3 Michelin stars and a 2-month waiting list. My stepmother Sylvia had chosen it, which told me everything about the evening's intent before I sat down. I arrived with a wrapped gift and found my seat already slightly apart from the main cluster of chairs, the kind of arrangement that happens when a table is set by someone who has made decisions about spacing before the guests arrive. My brother-in-law said something about my dress. The table laughed. My father looked at his menu. The gift I had brought was passed around and inspected and set aside with the particular care people use when handling something they find embarrassing. Part 1. I should tell you what the gift was. It was a first edition. A biography of my father's favorite economist, a man he had talked about since I was a child, whose ideas had shaped how my father saw money and labor and the relationship between the two. I had found the edition through a rare books dealer in London. It had taken me 3 weeks to source and another 2 to authenticate. The dealer had wrapped it in archival tissue and a simple olive green cover that looked, I will admit, like nothing special from the outside. Sylvia held it for approximately 4 seconds before passing it to my half-brother Marcus, who turned it over once and set it on the edge of the table near the bread basket. My father did not pick it up. He would, later. That is worth knowing. But in that moment, at that table, with Sylvia's hand resting on his arm and the ambient noise of a room full of people eating food that cost more per plate than most people's grocery budgets, he looked at the olive green cover and he looked away. My name is Natalie. I am 34 years old. I am a senior partner at a private equity firm with offices in New York, London, and Singapore. I manage a portfolio that, at its current valuation, represents more capital than most people will encounter in any form in their entire lives. I say this not as a credential and not as a defense. I say it because the evening I am describing was constructed entirely around the assumption that I had none of it, and understanding what Sylvia and her family believed about me is necessary context for understanding what happened when they were wrong. I had kept my professional life quiet around my family for 6 years. Not out of shame. Out of observation. My father had remarried when I was 24, the year I finished my MBA and accepted my first associate position at the firm. Sylvia came with 2 adult children from a previous marriage, a social circle built on visible wealth, and a very particular interest in the financial architecture of my father's life. I watched her work for about 8 months before I understood what I was watching. And once I understood it, I made a decision that I have not regretted. I told them I was in finance. Nothing specific. When pressed, I said asset management. I kept my address in New York as a post office box forwarded to my assistant. My car, when I drove to family events, was a 7-year-old sedan I kept specifically for visits home. None of this was difficult. Privacy is not deception. It is simply the appropriate response to a room that has demonstrated it cannot be trusted with the truth. The dinner had been arranged, ostensibly, for my father's 62nd birthday. 12 people around a table in a private dining room that Sylvia had booked and that my father, I would later discover, had not been consulted about beyond being told when to arrive and what to wear. The guest list was Sylvia's construction. Her daughter Petra and Petra's husband Greg. Her son Marcus. 2 couples from their social circle who I had met twice and whose names I had to relearn each time. My father. And me, presumably included because excluding me entirely would have required a conversation Sylvia preferred to avoid. Greg started it. He usually did. Greg was the kind of man who filled conversational silence with assessments of other people, delivered with the confidence of someone who has never had his assessments challenged in any meaningful way. He looked at my dress and said something about how casual I had come. He said it with a smile. He said it the way things are said at tables like that, lightly enough to be deniable, loudly enough to land. The table responded in the way tables respond when someone says something at that register. A few small laughs. A brief moment of collective attention directed at me. Sylvia touched her wine glass. My father did not look up. I did not respond to Greg. I unfolded my napkin and placed it in my lap and picked up the menu and read it with the specific focus of someone who has decided not to perform a reaction for a room that is waiting for one. This had a deflating effect on Greg, which I noted and found mildly satisfying. But the evening was not finished with me yet. Sylvia had barely begun. She ordered for the table without asking whether anyone had preferences. She described the menu to her friends with the proprietary fluency of someone who needed the room to understand that she had been here before and that arriving here was a demonstration of something. She mentioned the name of the chef. She mentioned what she had eaten on a previous visit. She said that some people found the tasting menu overwhelming but that she had always felt one should simply lean into the experience. She looked at me when she said overwhelming. I looked back at her, and I smiled, and I said I was sure I would manage. Part 2. Sylvia had been managing my place in this family since the year she arrived in it. I want to be precise about this, because it would be easy to describe her as simply unkind and leave it there. She was more specific than unkind. She was strategic. She understood, very early in her relationship with my father, that I was the one element of his life that existed outside her direct influence, and she had spent the subsequent 10 years addressing that with the patient, methodical attention of someone who has identified a structural problem and intends to resolve it quietly. I was 24 when they married. Old enough that she had no parental authority over me, which I believe frustrated her more than she ever acknowledged. She could not shape me. She could not redirect me the way she could redirect my father's attention and resources and time. What she could do was define me. And she had been doing that, in the language of small public moments, for a decade. The first time was at their wedding reception. I had given a toast. I had prepared it carefully, genuine, warm, specific to my father in ways that only someone who had known him his whole life could be specific. Sylvia stood beside him while I spoke and wore the patient expression of someone waiting for something mediocre to finish. When I sat down, she leaned across to her daughter Petra and said something I was not meant to hear clearly. I heard it clearly. She said, "Bless her, she does try." The table near them responded with the small, sympathetic sounds people make when they have been given permission to find something endearing rather than impressive. I filed that moment without a label. I had many unlabeled files by then. At my father's 60th birthday, 2 years earlier, Sylvia had introduced me to her friends as my husband's daughter. She works in finance, very sensible. Not unkind words. Just carefully chosen ones. Sensible was doing considerable work in that sentence. It positioned me as someone competent in a modest way, reliable in a limited register, the human equivalent of a practical household item that serves its function without inspiring any particular feeling. Her friends had nodded with the mild interest people extend to sensible things before moving on to more interesting ones. My father had not corrected the introduction. He never corrected anything where Sylvia was concerned. I had watched this develop over the decade of their marriage with the same careful attention I brought to financial structures, observing the mechanism, tracing the influence, noting where the real authority resided in what appeared to be an equal arrangement. My father was not a weak man. He was a tired one. He had built a successful importing business over 30 years through considerable personal effort, and he had arrived at his late 50s wanting, I think, to set something down. Sylvia had presented herself as a place to set it. He had accepted. What came with that acceptance was a gradual transfer of social authority that my father either did not notice or chose not to examine. Sylvia planned the events. Sylvia managed the relationships. Sylvia decided who sat where and how the family presented itself to its social world, and my father moved through those decisions the way a man moves through a house someone else has furnished, comfortably enough, without much thought about how it had come to look the way it looked. I had accepted my position in that arrangement for a long time. Not because I agreed with it. Because I had my own life in a different city and my own work that occupied the majority of my attention and my own reasons for choosing, each time, to attend these events rather than disengage from them entirely. My reason was my father. That is the plain truth. Underneath the decade of managed invisibility and Sylvia's careful introductions and Greg's dinner table assessments, my father was still the man who had driven me to school every morning for 8 years and kept every report card I had ever brought home in a manila folder in his desk drawer that I had seen once by accident and never mentioned to him. He was complicated and he was compromised and he had made choices I did not agree with. He was still my father. I came to these dinners for him. Sylvia knew that. It was, I sometimes thought, the most useful thing she knew about me. That evening, between the second and third courses, she decided to use it. She raised her glass. She said she wanted to say something about family. The table quieted with the attentive expectation of people who had been primed for a performance. She spoke warmly about my father. She spoke about their life together. She said she was grateful for the family they had built. Then she looked at me and said she hoped all of us appreciated what we had here. The emphasis on all was slight. Barely perceptible. But every person at that table understood exactly who she was speaking to. Part 3. The moment arrived between the fourth course and the dessert menu. I had not planned it. I want to be clear about that, because what happened next had the quality of something orchestrated, and it was not. It was simply the natural consequence of a set of conditions that had been building for a decade, arriving at the only conclusion available to them once the right pressure was applied. I did not apply the pressure. Sylvia did. The server brought the bill in the particular way bills are brought at restaurants of that caliber, discreetly, without announcement, set near the host with the practiced invisibility of someone who understands that the transaction is a formality and not the point. Sylvia reached for it immediately. This was her gesture. Her territory. She took the bill at family dinners the way she took up space in every room, with the assumption that the right to do so was self-evident and required no confirmation. She placed her card on the folder without looking at the total. The server returned 2 minutes later. He spoke quietly, leaning slightly towards Sylvia, the practiced discretion of someone delivering information that the recipient would not want delivered at volume. Sylvia's expression did not change immediately. There was a half-second of perfect stillness, the kind that happens when a person receives information that conflicts with their understanding of their own situation, and then she said something to him in a low voice. He nodded and moved away again. The table had noticed. Not all of it. But the people closest to her, Petra, Greg, Marcus, had seen the exchange and were now performing the careful non-attention of people who have registered something they are not sure how to respond to. Sylvia looked at my father. My father began reaching for his jacket pocket. I said, quietly, that I could cover it. Sylvia's eyes moved to me. The expression on her face in that moment contained several things at once. Surprise, which she controlled quickly. Calculation, which she was less successful at hiding. And underneath both of those, something that I recognized from a decade of sitting across from her at tables like this one, a rapid reassessment. The kind that happens when someone realizes the map they have been using is not accurate. I handed my card to the server when he returned. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Greg said, "Are you sure about that?" with the specific intonation of a man who is asking a question he already believes he knows the answer to. I told him I was sure. Sylvia said something about it being too much to ask. I said I hadn't been asked, and that it was fine. My father was looking at me with an expression I had seen only a handful of times in my life, an open, unguarded attention, as if he was seeing something he had not adequately looked at before. The server returned with the receipt. The total was $4,240 for 12 people across 7 courses and 4 bottles of wine that Sylvia had selected without consulting the table. I signed without pausing. The server thanked me and withdrew. The table recalibrated in the way tables do after something unexpected. Conversation resumed, but at a different register, with a different center of gravity. Sylvia was quieter. Greg had lost his angle. Petra was looking at her phone with the focused attention of someone who needs something to look at. My father picked up the book. He had left it at the edge of the table for 3 hours. He reached across now, without ceremony, and picked it up and turned it over and looked at the cover properly for the first time. He opened it to the title page. He looked at the date of publication. He looked at me. He said, "Where did you find this?" I told him. The London dealer. The 3 weeks. The authentication. He held it in both hands and nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something was settling into a place he had made for it. He said it was extraordinary. He said it quietly, for me only, in the voice he used before Sylvia had arrived in our family and reorganized the acoustics of every room. Sylvia was watching this from across the table. I met her eyes briefly. Not as a challenge. Not with anything that required a response. I simply looked at her with the calm attention of someone who has been assessed incorrectly for a very long time and has decided, in this particular moment at this particular table, to let the record begin correcting itself. Then I excused myself and walked to the restroom and stood quietly for a moment by the window at the end of the corridor, looking at the street below. I took a slow breath. The next part would unfold on its own. These things always did, once the first true piece of information entered the room. Part 4. I had known about Sylvia's financial arrangements for 14 months. Not because I had gone looking. Because the firm I work for operates across a broad enough portfolio that certain names, certain structures, certain patterns of capital movement pass through our analysis in the ordinary course of business. 14 months earlier, a compliance review of a mid-tier commercial real estate fund had surfaced an irregularity. A series of transactions routed through a holding company that existed on paper with a convincing level of detail but whose underlying assets, when examined carefully, were not what the documentation described. The name attached to the beneficial ownership of that holding company was a trust. The trust had a named administrator. The administrator was Sylvia. I had sat with that for 3 days before deciding what to do with it. Not because I was uncertain about what it represented. I was not uncertain. The structure was a variation on a scheme I had seen twice in my professional career, not common, but not rare, favored by people who were sophisticated enough to build the first layer of concealment correctly and not sophisticated enough to anticipate what a second layer of examination would find. What made Sylvia's version specific was its scale and its duration. The fund had been operating for 6 years. The total misappropriation, across 4 related entities, was just under $9 million. The investors who had been defrauded were largely individuals, retirees, and small business owners, people who had been introduced to the fund through a network of referrals that traced back, through several intermediary steps, to Greg. Greg, who assessed people's dresses at dinner tables. Greg, who asked questions he believed he already knew the answers to. I had passed the documentation to our compliance team and from there to the appropriate federal authorities, and from there I had done what I always did with active matters outside my direct management. I had let the process work at its own pace and returned my attention to my own responsibilities. The process, it turned out, had chosen my father's birthday dinner as the evening it was ready to move. I was still standing at the corridor window when my phone vibrated. A message from a contact at the firm whose name I recognized as someone who monitored active referrals to federal investigators. The message contained 4 words and a timestamp. It had happened 20 minutes ago, 2 miles from the restaurant, at the address I knew as Sylvia and my father's home. A coordinated execution of 2 warrants, one for the premises and one for Greg's office, which shared a building with the fund's registered address. I put my phone in my bag. I walked back to the table. The room had shifted in my absence in a way I recognized before I understood its specific cause. Sylvia's phone was in her hand and her face had the quality of someone who has received information that is too large to process in a public setting and is using every available resource to appear as though they have not. Petra was leaning toward her mother, speaking quietly. Greg's chair was empty. Marcus was looking at the door. My father was looking at me. I sat down. I folded my hands on the table. I did not ask any questions. I did not offer any information. I simply sat with the particular stillness of someone who is not surprised by what is happening and does not need to perform any reaction in response to it. Sylvia looked at me across the table. I want to tell you what I saw in her face in that moment, because it was not what I expected. It was not rage. It was not the calculating reassessment I had seen earlier. It was simpler than that. It was the expression of a person who has just understood, fully and finally, that they have fundamentally misread another person for a very long time. Every managed introduction. Every loaded emphasis. Every carefully orchestrated dinner table moment designed to establish what I was and was not. All of it, constructed on an assessment that had been wrong from the beginning. She started to say my name. I told her gently that she should call her attorney. Then I stood up. I said goodnight to my father. He stood too, which he did not need to do but which told me something. He held my hand for a moment and I let him, and I did not make it longer than it needed to be. I picked up my bag. I left the restaurant. Outside, the city was doing what cities do on Thursday evenings, indifferent, continuous, entirely uninterested in the specific gravity of any individual life moving through it. I walked half a block to where my driver was waiting. Not the 7-year-old sedan. My actual car. I had decided, getting dressed that evening, that there was no longer a reason to maintain the performance in that particular direction. My driver asked how the dinner was. I said it had been eventful. He pulled into traffic. I looked out the window at the lights moving past and I thought about my father's hands on that book. The way he had said extraordinary. The voice he had used before Sylvia had reorganized the acoustics of every room. Greg was arrested the following morning. Sylvia was contacted by federal investigators that same evening and entered a process that would occupy the next several years of her life and the resources accumulated across 6 years of a scheme that had never, ultimately, been as invisible as she had believed. My father called me on Sunday. The call lasted 40 minutes. He asked questions I answered and asked questions I didn't, and I let him have both without making a distinction between them. He said he had been reading the book. He said it was remarkable. He said he was sorry, and then he said what he was sorry for, specifically, and it was specific enough that I could tell he had been thinking about how to say it for at least 2 days. I told him I knew. I told him I would come for dinner next month. Real dinner, I said. Somewhere quiet. Just us. He said that sounded right. It did sound right. It was the most right thing that had been said between us in a long time. My professional life continued at the pace it always moved, significant, demanding, and almost entirely invisible to the people who had once used the word sensible to describe what I did and considered it sufficient. I did not correct that record publicly. I did not post about any of it or tell the story at industry events or make of it something that required an audience. The work was its own record. The portfolio was its own statement. The quiet, uninterrupted accumulation of a professional life built without anyone's permission or acknowledgement was a more durable form of evidence than anything I could have said across a dinner table. A first edition biography sat on a shelf in my father's study. He sent me a photograph of it a few weeks after the dinner. He had framed it. Not the book, the shelf, the way it looked in the context of his other books, settled and belonging. He sent it without a caption. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I saved it, and got back to work.